I think we're good to go now. So my name is Chesnut, and I am the Secondary Transition Program Specialist in the Special Education Services Department. I work next to Jill, and we wear many hats, so I have some other roles, but my favorite part of my job is when I get to talk to future educators or to current educators and talk about best practices in the area of secondary transition. So that's what we're going to spend our time with today. So first we'll look at the requirements under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Oklahoma State Policy. Next, we will talk just briefly about Individual Career Academic Planning, or ICAP. Raise your hand if you have heard that buzzword. Maybe you have children that are going through ICAP right now, or you've heard it if you're in the schools. Okay, great. So we'll talk briefly about ICAP. Then I'm going to show you a sample transition plan in OK Ed Plan, which is our IEP system. And then we'll talk briefly about the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and Pre-Employment Transition Services. That's that's with our partners, our DRS partners. So our Department of Rehabilitation Services, or VOC Rehab. Have you guys heard of that term? Vocational rehabilitation. So we'll talk briefly about that. And then finally, I'll share some resources and answer any questions that you may have. So why transition planning? You know, what's the big deal? So I love this cartoon. It says, "Congratulations, Larry. Again this year, you have achieved your IEP goals." Thank you. I'm sorry. You're not prepared for a real job. So here's Larry, here's his teacher saying, here you go, way to go, you've achieved your goals. Here's Larry at the employment agency, you're not prepared for a real job. How can that be? I've achieved all my IEP goals. Don't understand. There's a disconnect there, right? So that is the importance of transition planning. Everything that we do with our students needs to be preparing them for life after high school. So it is important. So Larry learns the hard way that school and the real world don't always see success the same way, but my goal is that that's starting to change, and we're starting to really see the impact, you know, of everything that we do needs to relate to what they want to do afterwards, after high school. So, who in here has heard of, have you guys got into the purpose of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? Okay, so it's to provide a free, appropriate public education. What's the next part of this? What comes after free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet those unique needs? There's a second part. Anybody want to guess what that might be? Good. Secondary services. So the whole point is to prepare our students for further education, employment, and independent living. So it's in, transition services are right in that FAPE statement. Okay, that emphasizes the importance of it, right? Now in IDEA, secondary transition services must begin by age 16. But in Oklahoma, we have a state policy, and the wording in that state policy states that the transition services must be in effect prior to the beginning of 9th grade, or age 16, whichever comes first. So what that means is that you are going to be developing the transition plan as part of the IEP during that 8th grade year. That will ensure that the services are in place the first day of 9th grade. Does that make sense? You can always start it earlier. Many of our districts are starting the individual career academic planning as early as 6th grade. So that, in my opinion, that's a great time to start transition planning as part of the IEP, because they're already going to be doing some things with their ICAP. Okay, but you must start it during that 8th grade year. Oh, let me go back for a second. So as Jill mentioned, you'll have this PowerPoint, and there are links throughout the PowerPoint. So if you have more questions or you wanted resources, so this refers to our policies, the process guide, and the handbook. So throughout the PowerPoint, you'll see resources and links that will take you to where this information comes from. So what are the transition requirements under the IDEA? We're going to talk about each one of these things this morning. So first of all, students must participate in age-appropriate transition assessments annually. From those assessments, that guides the rest of the IEP, the rest of the transition plan. They must have post-secondary goals, annual transition goals, transition services, course of study. It's really important to have student input that is in the IDEA. The students must be invited to their meeting, and if they cannot attend, we must ensure that their preferences and interests are considered. And then outside agency participation is crucial for facilitating from high school to the outside world. So connecting them with outside agencies that might be able to provide or pay for transition services is a huge part of transition planning. Okay, the Indicator 13 checklist was developed to ensure that states and districts are in compliance with transition. Okay, so this is what the Indicator 13 checklist looks like. You will not see this in Ed Plan, but the rules of completion are built in, so as you go along and you're writing your transition plan, if you forget one of these components, you'll get an error message, so it will prompt you along the way. I'm not going to read all of this, but it's basically just the information that I went over with you, just in a question format, and you can refer back to it. Okay, in addition to the requirements under the IDEA, we are always looking at what's happening in the courts with transition. So a few years ago, Prince, Plotner, and Yell examined district court findings, and this is what they determined, and this is what they recommend for districts. That I mentioned earlier that students must participate in age-appropriate transition assessments. So what they recommend is multiple assessments, not just one. Okay, so not just Casey Life Skills in 9th grade and then that's it, right? So we want to make sure that students are participating in a variety of assessments. And they also recommend that you don't just use informal assessments. So you don't just do like an interview, like, hey, what do you want to do when you grow up? Or a simple checklist. They recommend that you use a type of assessment that has, and that's formal. So that means it has ample reliability and validity. Okay, again, that's not a requirement in IDEA, but it is recommended. It strengthens your transition plan. And then I cannot emphasize enough the importance of student input. So that came out in the courts too, and the court cases where the courts ruled in favor of the families, many times there was a lack of student involvement in the IEP and transition planning process. So make sure that your students are involved, that they're writing their own goals, that they have choices about what assessments they want to take, and they have input along the way. Many districts work their way up to student-led IEPs, which is fabulous. Now that takes a process, and depending on your students, some may or may not be able to do that at various stages, but if you start with them young, and every year you have them do more and more and more, by high school, they're very comfortable leading their IEP. Any questions so far? And again, we're going to break down each one of these. Okay, so transition assessment is just an ongoing process, and we are collecting data. Everything that we do in special ed revolves around the data, right? So we're looking at what are the students' strengths, what are the students' interests, what are their preferences, and then what are their needs. And those needs that we identify, that's going to become the annual transition goals. Transition assessment should address these areas. So education and training and employment are required for all students. Independent living, and in Oklahoma we also look at community participation. Okay, that's best practice. So hopefully you're giving your students assessments in all of these areas and identifying their strengths, their needs, their preferences, and their interests. All of these results from the assessments we're going to document as part of our present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Have you guys talked about this already yet, the present levels? Great, great. So transition assessments must be documented. Now in Ed Plan, it looks a little different. How many of you have seen Ed Plan? You've been in that system or you've seen some IEPs? Okay. It looks a little different where you can document it, and that's okay. The important thing is that it's documented, okay? So in Ed Plan, you can document the transition assessments in the assessment narrative. So you can give an overall description or summary of the assessments under each assessment, or you can, under the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance in the transition tab, you can also put it there, okay? Just make sure that it's documented. From the results, that's going to lead the rest of the IEPs. That's where we're going to get our goals and our services and our coordinated activities. Okay, you don't have to participate in this, but if you have a QR code on your phone, or if you want to type in this address, this is just kind of a little activity. So if you want to scan that, you're welcome to. All right, would someone be willing to share what your results of your transition assessment is? Would you mind sharing, sir?
I got a pilot.
All right, so you got a pilot. All right, awesome. Have you ever thought about becoming a pilot? No. And you're not allowed to change, by the way, you're not allowed to change your occupation as a result of this assessment today. You have to stay in special ed. We're keeping you. All right, would anyone else be willing to share? Yes.
I got writer.
Writer. All right, great. Anyone else?
Just a second.
I got a teacher. I was like, all right.
Really? Wow, you're the first teacher that I've seen on that. That is fabulous. I got veterinarian.
I got a teacher.
Teacher, wow. Okay. Anyone else?
I got actor.
Actor, I love it. All right. Okay, so what do you guys think about this? You think this would be a reliable assessment that you would want to use to develop goals for your students?
Sure.
Yeah, probably not, but it's kind of a fun activity that you can do with your kids to kind of set the stage for and talk about, informal and formal and meaningful and all of that. So we always have fun with that one. Okay, so again, assessments can be categorized in lots of different ways. We have informal, like interviews, questionnaires, observation, inventories, and then we have formal, which means that they have gone through like some research and they have been determined to have reliability and validity. So they really measure what we want them to measure, and then if we take them again and again and again, we're likely to get the same results, okay? So things like achievement tests, self-determination assessments, aptitude, and adaptive behavior skills. Those are all more formal. Before we get into the next part where we really start talking about, the post-secondary goals and annual goals and all of that, I wanted to share with you my colleagues at the University of Oklahoma, go Sooners, we're gonna make a comeback next week, that they developed this to just kind of give you a visual, because transition planning is complicated, guys. I have my master's degree in it, and I don't know everything. I'm learning every day. So this just kind of gives you a visual to see that once we have our post-secondary goals, everything else is going to relate to that. So our annual goals and our coordinated activities are all going to come back to those post-secondary goals. So just keep this in mind as we talk about the post-secondary goals and annual goals and activities. All right, so repeat after me. Post means after. What does post mean? After. After. Please, please, please put that. If you just learned one thing from my time with you today, that would be awesome. Okay? Post means after. We've given our students these assessments. All right? Now, from those assessments, each student must have post-secondary goals in the areas of education and training and employment. That means what they want to do after high school, okay? Now, the IEP team can also develop goals in independent living and community participation. How many of you are planning on teaching students with more significant support needs, like students that may participate in the Oklahoma Alternate Achievement Standards, or the OAP? More students with more severe profound needs? If you're going to work with that population, those students will also need, they'll be required to have goals in all areas, okay? Okay, so post-secondary goals need to be measurable, and how we determine if they're measurable is if they answer these questions. So where will the student learn after high school? Where will the student work after high school? Where will the student live after high school? And then how will the student participate in the community after high school? So there's our areas.
And with the severe profound children, would you do more of this with parents?
Yes. Yes. So the question was, as far as the assessments for students with more severe profound needs, would you do more with the families? And yes, and transition assessment looks different for students with very, very severe profound disabilities. We want our families involved along the way with all of our students, but it's especially important to get that family input. And there is a module within EdPlan, if you are going to be teaching this population within Pepper, that is just on transition assessments for students with more significant support needs. So I would highly encourage you to check out that module if you're going to be working with that population, because with our time today, we're not going to have time to go into every single detail about that. It's a great question. Okay, so let's see, what do you think about these goals? And there's really no right or wrong answers with this right now. I just want to get your input. So would you think that these goals are measurable? So the first one is, Ryan will take the courses needed to graduate from high school. So does that sound like a post-secondary goal? Ryan will take the courses needed for graduation. I hear no's. Woo! You guys are rock stars already. All right. Okay, why is it no? Okay, it's not post, right? It's not after. You would not believe how many times I see this as a post-secondary goal, right? Taking the courses to graduate from high school, first of all, exactly like you said, it's not happening after high school. Secondly, every student's trying to take the courses necessary to graduate from high school, right? So it's no different for them. It doesn't make that transition plan specialized or unique for that student. Okay, good job. Okay, what about this next one? Ryan is thinking about joining the Air Force. He's thinking about it. What do you think about that one?
I mean, it
Okay. do you say?
It's not a goal.
It's not a goal.
It's
Okay.
not measurable.
It's not measurable. Okay, good. It's too vague, right? We want to stay away. Our friends from NTAC, the National Technical Assistance Center, we go to them for everything related to transition. What they have said about goals like this, just like you said, it's not measurable. It's too vague. So it's better to say, you know, he will do this.
Well, but it is a starting point where you could get him some information about the Air Force, maybe
Absolutely.
have him talk to a recruiter, and then he could possibly say, I will.
Right, and it is, but what our guidance from NTAC is just to go ahead and say he will from the beginning. And then in this coordinated activities, you're gonna do all those things you mentioned, but it's still better so that it's measurable. You're not gonna be held to, if he actually does that, what you're gonna be held accountable for is, did you help him while he was in high school do the things to get him to where he said that he wanted, you know? So it's still better to go ahead and say. Okay, what about this one? Ryan might live with his parents or on base. Is that measurable? So it's that same thing, right? It might, let's just take away that might and say he will. Okay, this one's tricky. What about Ryan participates in ROTC? Is that a post-secondary goal?
No, ROTC is in high school.
Right, so this could be important to document that, right? But it's not a post-secondary goal. Okay, good, you guys are doing awesome. Okay, here's some examples. So for education and training, upon graduation from high school, Ryan will join the Air Force, or in Ed Plan, and in Oklahoma, we like to put them in the first person. So upon graduation from high school, I will join the Air Force. Employment, upon graduation from high school, Ryan will receive on-the-job training in the Air Force. So I will receive on-the-job training in the Air Force. Independent living, upon graduation from high school, Ryan will live on base. So I will live on base. And then community participation, Ryan will use transportation to travel in the community. So I will use public transportation to travel in the community. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions about post-secondary goals? You guys, thumbs up if you feel like you got that one. All right, awesome. Okay, I love this. How many of you have worked with students or your own children where, I mean, their goals were, woo, right? And we want to have high expectations for our students. That's so important. We don't want to be dream crushers, okay? But what's happening too often is that students are graduating with still not these realistic goals of what they're going to be able to do. So we call this the Fluff scale. And the idea behind this is that when students are younger, so this starts with middle school, but I would even say let's start even earlier. So let's start in elementary, okay? If your students say they want to be an NFL player, or what are the other common ones that you hear? Doctor, MBA.
My 5-year-old wants to be a Ghostbuster.
Ghostbuster, I love it. One of the ladies that works here, her 5-year-old wants to be a dinosaur. Okay, if you want to be a dinosaur at 5 years old, you go for it, right? It's okay to have fluff. But the older that our students get, okay, by the time they're a senior in high school, we really want to have a firm match between the things I mentioned earlier. Okay, their strengths. Do they have the skills that are needed to do the job that they think they want to do? Do they have, if they want to go to college, because you don't have an IEP in college, right? You have to meet those same requirements, those entry requirements into college as everyone else. Now, once you're admitted, you can qualify for some accommodations under the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, but there's no IEP in college. okay? So we don't want to set our students up if they want to go to college, but they can't meet those entrance requirements, okay? Now, we do have some programs for students with intellectual disabilities, and there are some programs out there. So I'm not saying that if you have an intellectual disability or you have a significant cognitive disability that you can't go to college. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying that by the time they're a senior, we want to have more realistic goals. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so we've got our post-secondary goals. Now let's talk about the annual goals. So from the results of those transition assessments, we are going to develop annual goals for our students in those areas that I mentioned earlier. So these goals are going to address what skills the students will learn during this school year so that they will demonstrate movement toward their post-secondary goal. So let's say that they want to attend a four-year college to become a teacher. But we know from our present levels that their reading level is not where it should be. So maybe we're going to have a goal that they're going to really work on increasing their reading level. Okay. Sometimes these can be related to behavior. Okay? One of my favorite stories we just had the Oklahoma Transition Institute, and we had the privilege of having Dr. Scott Solberg come and present. And he's well known nationwide with individual learning plans. And he shared this story about a young man that was a little oppositional defiant, right? And argued and didn't always get along, had a little trouble with authority. And they had some firefighters come and share, just like share and tell about, what's it like to be a firefighter. That made an impact on that young man from just that visit with that firefighter, because the firefighter mentioned something about, authority and having to take direction, and something in that young man, it clicked. And then all of a sudden, he was finally at a point where he was ready to work on his behavior. And that's the impact that sometimes you can have just by exposing them to people in different careers, letting them go out to, job shadowing opportunities. I mean, it can trigger it, because we can say it and say it and say it, and sometimes they need to hear it in a different way or hear it from somebody else. So I just love that story. So they're not just statements of passing a class. This is another one that I see frequently. It's like, Johnny will pass English with 70% accuracy. And that's the annual transition goal. No. Okay, so first of all, that's not based on assessment results, right? And again, that's what everyone's trying to do. So it's not specific. Annual transition goals, we must have them in the areas of education, training, and employment. And then independent living and community participation are required for students participating in the OAP. It's really best practice to have them in all four areas for all students, because I don't know about you guys, but I have never met a young person that didn't need some help in the area of independent living, right? With money management. There's so many things. I thought I did a pretty good job with my own children. They're 18 and 21 years old now, but there's still things that it's like, well, my son's actually in the process of buying a house because he started paying rent. And there's like so many things like to buying a house that we didn't talk to him about, First of all, I didn't think he'd be buying a house at 21, so good for him. But there's a lot. Adulting is hard. I'm still trying to figure it out. All right. In addition to annual goals, the students who take the OAP must also have short-term objectives. Okay, so they have to have that for all of their goals must have short-term objectives, and transition annual goals are no different. when you are creating your annual goals, these are some questions to consider. So what skills does the student need to learn this year to go to school where they want? What skills does the student need to learn this year to work where they want? What skills does the student need to learn this year to live where they want? And I mentioned the importance of student input earlier. Sometimes you have more than one thing, and you have to decide, what are we going to work on this year, right? You have to prioritize. Get your students' involvement and input on this, okay? It can line up to their course of study. What classes are they currently going to be taking where these skills will be taught in these classes? So there's a lot to consider with annual goals. Again, they need to be measurable. Have you guys had a chance to talk about just SMART goals yet? Writing a good goal? Okay, so they need to have a condition, which is the application of skills or knowledge. They need to have a behavior that identifies the performance being monitored or describes the materials, environment necessary to complete the goal, and then a criterion. How much, how often. Here are some examples of annual transition goals. So we're referring back to Ryan because remember, everything is related to that post-secondary goal. So think back to Ryan. Ryan's goal for post-secondary education and training was to join the Air Force. So when asked, Ryan will identify the steps he must take to become accepted into the Air Force with 90% accuracy. That's something that he's going to have to do if he's going to go to the Air Force. He's going to have to know how to get there, right? For employment, again, he was going to join the Air Force and receive on-the-job training, so his annual employment goal will be, when asked, Ryan will report 3 possible Air Force occupations as well as the salary for each. So do you feel like, do these goals meet the criteria for a SMART goal? Are they measurable? Do you see a behavior and a condition and a criterion? Okay. Okay, community participation. He will navigate his community, so when asked, Ryan will determine transportation options available with 90% accuracy. So, and this can vary depending on where you live or where he's going to be stationed, but we just want him to know kind of what might be out there. In Oklahoma, what's our main method of transportation? A car, right? But that's not always true in other places. So we want him to be, familiar with some of those other options. Independent living, he will live on base. So his annual goal for that might be when asked, he's going to describe 2 housing options available to enlisted personnel. Okay, so all of those annual transition goals relate back to his post-secondary goals.
So if they're doing alternate testing under those goals, you have to have objectives.
That's correct,
But
yes.
if they're not, you just leave the goal.
You could still have objectives if you wanted to break it down, like with the, you could break it down with the steps. You could break it down into objectives, take the steps of what you have to do to get to the military and break it down by objectives. So you can always do objectives. And I think personally that's a great way to do all your goals, but it's not required except for students who are participating in the OAP. So that's a great question. example, again, if you are going to be working with students who participate in the OAP, or you may not know, so you want that information because you're not sure, we have, in the module that I mentioned, there are some fabulous examples of transition plans for students with more significant support needs that have the objectives. And then also the OU Zero Center has trainings and they post the training. So I'll show you guys where that is a little bit later on.
I have two questions. So, like the military example, I
Yes.
do have a couple of my kiddos that, you know, they're 8th grade, they've decided they want to do. I know we look at post, but before you can get into the military, you have to take the ASVAB. So can that be one of your goals? That they take the ASVAB even though it's not?
It can be. We like to go a little more broad. So like that example, demonstrate the steps and then taking the ASVAB as more of a coordinated activity. And that's actually, we're almost there.
Oh.
I'll show you that. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So another requirement is the course of study. So the course of study identifies the specific classes or courses that the students are going to take, and that can be special education or general education. Okay? So which courses are going to directly support progress toward the post-secondary and the annual goals? So example, we got a different one. This time it's Kindle. So Kindle's post-secondary goal is to become a graphic designer. So Kindle's course of study needs to be, you know, not only those core classes that you must take for graduation, but what classes are going to be related to the post-secondary goal. So we would love to see Kindle participating in graphic communication, design and layout, and drawing and illustration. Okay, so, and that, many of our career and technical education, they have graphic design programs. So you would want, if this was your student and this was your student's goals, you would want to be checking into your career tech to, you know, get that course catalog, see what the requirements are. If it's not offered in your area, what other courses can you think that they could still take that would be closely related to graphic design? Even if you didn't have a graphic design program where you live. Can you guys think of some other classes that would at least be close? What do you need to be a graphic designer?
Art be one because you're still dealing with drawing.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were in a rural community, you know, or you didn't have graphic design, at least art would be important. What other skills do you need to be a graphic designer? Computer, so technology classes, computer classes. Okay, so you line it up as closely as you can. And depending on how old the student is, that's going to impact, you know, that course of study. Okay, so just some more tips for course of study. What classes and activities do I need to prepare me to learn, live, and work where I want after leaving school, and then what extra activities do I need? So the answer to these questions becomes the course of study. This is an example. This is not currently what it looks like in Ed Plan, but I'm hoping that we're going to get to that point. This is where the IEP team actually lays out every year. So we would want ours to start in 8th grade. This is an example from another state. So they started theirs in 9th grade. But the post-school goal is that after graduation from high school, Kevin will work 20 or more hours as a sous chef in the deli of a local grocery store. So that's the post-secondary goal. And they have the course of study laid out. So you can see the core classes like English. Then we have math, environmental science, then we have some computers and foreign language, and then electives. Then in 10th grade, English, math, geography, food science, so starting to get into, you know, the relationship between that, accounting and health. Then in 11th grade, English again, math, civics, culinary arts. consumer strategies, physical ed, math. 12th grade, we have English again, math, culinary arts 2, food prep. So you see not only the courses required for graduation because you need to graduate, but also you see that relationship between what they want to do. Okay, so that's the course of study. I mentioned ICAP earlier, the individual career academic planning. There's a requirement in the ICAP for, they don't call it the course of study, but it's the course of study. It's more intentional about what students are taking. I know my son especially, his senior year was like a blow off. I mean, he barely had any, he had his credits already. He was taking classes that he didn't need and that weren't in any way related to what he wanted to do. He didn't listen to mom, by the way. But hopefully with more intentional planning, we won't have as many of those cases.
Are we required to help our kids sign up for the Oklahoma Promise?
Yes. So the question is the Oklahoma Promise. How many of you guys have heard of the Oklahoma Promise? Okay. That is Oklahoma residents, and there's certain qualifications, and it's by income. But certain, if you meet the requirements, you can attend college for tuition free, okay, through the Oklahoma Promise. And that has to be decided, that application and everything, that happens in the 8th grade, 9th grade year. So her question was, are we required for that? And the answer is yes. So going back to the course of study, if the student has anything on their transcript that says that they're like essential classes or basic classes, anything that would look different than just English 1, English 2, English 3, English 4, then they would not qualify. Now, we don't, different districts, even though we have state course codes, different districts sometimes code some stuff different ways, okay? So you want to make sure if your student plans to go to college or the career techs that they are taking the courses that everyone else is taking. And there's even language in there that if they're taught to alternate standards, they can qualify. Okay? So that's why we put that question in Ed Plan about OK Promise. Is the student planning to participate in OK Promise? If the answer is yes, you want to work toward, if they're in all special ed classes, direct instruction all day, the team might want to consider moving them into more general education classes, okay, seeing how they handle that. Because you've got to start planning early because like I said, you have to fill all that out that 8th grade year.
So that would mean like the kids who take English, science, math, social studies in lab classes.
That's a tough question. Okay. We have been told that if they take lab classes, they won't qualify, okay? But like I mentioned earlier, different districts code things in different ways, okay? So you're going to have to check with your district that you're working in to find that out for sure. Because if it's coded exactly the same way, I'm not sure that OK Promise realizes that it was a lab class. But like I said, I mean, we have been told if they're in a lab class, there's probably going to be modifications or accommodations, even if they're working on the same curriculum. So that would be considered alternate achievement standards. So it's hard for me to answer that because it's really going to vary with what that lab class looks like and how it's coded in a district. So I'm sorry I'm being vague, but that's just kind of how it is. No, you're good. You're good. That's a great question because we have to talk about this because I have heard students who were planning on using the OK Promise and then they weren't accepted because they were in lab classes or they were taught to alternate achievement standards. So, and we've got to, like I said, you've got to start planning it early. For more information, you can visit the OK Promise or talk to your counselors at your schools because they're really the experts on it. Okay. So we mentioned transition services earlier. Transition services means a coordinated set of activities. We have different types of transition services. So we have instruction. If you have a student that needs to learn how to advocate for themselves, because I mentioned earlier, if they go to college, they're not going to have an IEP, so they're going to have to go to the disability support services and request accommodations. Their parent can't call for them, right? The disability support services will only talk to them. So if they're not good at doing that or they're uncomfortable, they don't even know that they're on an IEP, or they know that they're on an IEP, but they don't know what their disability is or really what their accommodations are, that's a problem, okay? So if they need direct instruction in self-advocacy, that may be a goal and a transition service that they're going to receive direct instruction in learning how to advocate for themselves. Related services, community experiences, employment, daily living skills. So all of these things are transition services. So the coordinated activities are the activities or tasks that the student will complete that will help them with the skills and knowledge associated with each annual goal. So you want to think about any activity, and we've already been talking about them this morning. So what does a student need to do? So some examples might be visit college campuses and meet with student support services, participate in an internship, develop skills to get needed items in a grocery store, develop a resume. So in your packet, I gave you a copy of some coordinated activities, just to get you thinking. Remember, those coordinated activities need to be tied directly to those annual transition goals. Coordinated activities can take place at school, home, or community, and the student can be responsible for them, the parent, the special ed teacher, general ed teacher, or outside staff like the vocational rehabilitation counselor. Okay, so let's go back to Ryan. So remember, Ryan's goal was that he would identify the steps he must take to become accepted into the Air Force. So what would be some appropriate coordinated activities for Ryan that would directly relate to his annual transition goal? So what are some smaller things that he needs to do to be able to identify the steps that he must take to go into the Air Force? You mentioned one earlier. Talk to a recruiter. What's the test that you have to take to go into the military? The ASVAB. Take the ASVAB. Get on the ASVAB website and take some practice tests, right? Anything else that you can think of that would be important? You wanted to go into the military.
Tinker's right here. I'm sure you could call and
Awesome.
get a tour or
Take a tour. Interview a person that's currently in the Air Force. Great, all great ideas. And there's not a right or wrong answer, you know, this is just an example student. So there could be, we would want to make it work for our student, of course, but I think you guys mentioned almost everything. If his school has an ROTC program, that would be a fabulous thing for him to do, to be participating in the ROTC. Research military careers. You can do that on the ASVAB website, so not only take practice tests, but start researching careers. All right, great job. Okay, a couple more requirements and we're close to a break. So I mentioned earlier, student input. You're gonna hear me say that again and again and again because it's so important. We want our students to be attending their meetings, actively participating in the transition planning process, get to the point where they're able to lead their IEP meeting, learn and practice self-determination skills. So the OU Zero Center has curriculum specifically designed to how to get students to lead their IEP meeting. Okay, so you don't have to make up something. There are a lot of materials out there and they're free that you can use with your students. Okay, crucial to transition planning success is that outside agency participation. Some of the agencies that you may be working with include the Department of Rehabilitation Services, or DRS, the Department of Human Services Developmental Disability Services Division, mental health, or possibly depending on your community, there are other agencies. So that's really important, especially DRS. Every single student that's on an IEP or that even has a disability, like our students that are on 504s, they need to be referred to the Department of Rehabilitation Services. And hopefully their parents will apply and they may qualify for services.
211 is other.
Yeah, that's a good referral. Yes, it is. Okay. So, when does special education end? Okay, I hear 21, 22. What else? When does special education and FAPE end? Graduation. Okay, you guys are exactly right. So when the student meets the requirements that apply to all students for the receipt of a regular high school diploma, or when the student turns 22 years of age. Now in Oklahoma, that student may finish the year because we have an Oklahoma state statute that states that any student that's 21 on or before September 1 has a right to an education. So we don't kick a child out just on their 22nd birthday if they've already started the year. We let them finish, okay? Unless the IEP team determines that they're ready to move on. Sometimes they are going on to something else, a different program, and so the team will go ahead and decide that they're going to go till December and then they're going to start the other program, but they have a right to finish the year, okay? This is considered a change of placement, but a reevaluation is not required. However, the team must provide the parent and student with written notice stating that the obligation for a FAPE is ending due to regular high school diploma or the student's aging out. So that's important. You must do a written notice, and then you must also complete a summary of performance. And that's just where you list any recent evaluation data, possibly their GPA. It's important to include progress towards their post-secondary goals and recommendations for helping them meet their post-secondary goals. So that's things like activities, accommodations, assistive technology, and strategies to help the student be successful. So all of that needs to be in the summary of performance.